Ladies and gentlemen, fellow enthusiasts of history, innovation, and courage, today I invite you to travel back to a time when the skies over Europe were filled with thunder, courage, and invention. A time when every drop of fuel, every degree of octane, and every heartbeat of an engine could mean the difference between life and death. Our story begins in the dark, uncertain years of World War II. The Allies were struggling to gain control of the skies. Germany's Luftwaffe, powerful, disciplined, and technologically advanced, dominated the air. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf WWII-90s ruled the European theater with unmatched speed and precision. Allied bombers flying deep into enemy territory often never made it home. Escort fighters simply couldn't go the distance. And then came the North American P-51 Mustang, sleek, elegant, and fast. But early models had a flaw: their engines, designed for lower-grade fuel, couldn't fully unleash the aircraft's potential. The Mustang was good, but it wasn't yet great. The war was about to change that. Enter the 150-grade aviation fuel, a technological leap that turned good pilots into legends and good aircraft into demons of the sky. Developed through relentless Allied experimentation, this high-octane fuel was like adrenaline for engines. It enabled them to run at higher boost pressures, squeeze more power out of every cylinder, and transform raw machinery into a weapon of unprecedented speed and endurance. With 150-grade fuel coursing through their Merlin engines, the Mustangs roared to life in ways no one thought possible. Top speeds jumped from 437 miles per hour to an astonishing 490 miles per hour. That's not just a number, it was a declaration. A message to the Luftwaffe that the rules of aerial combat had changed forever. Imagine being a German pilot at 25,000 feet, scanning the horizon. For months, you've had the advantage. Your aircraft can dive faster, climb higher, escape with ease. But then, one morning, the sound in the distance is different, sharper, more menacing. You turn, and there it is, a silver streak, diving from the sun, closing the gap faster than anything you've seen. The P-51, fueled by 150-grade power, tears through the air like a demon unleashed. In seconds, it's on your tail. You pull hard, but it follows effortlessly. You dive, it dives faster. You climb, it climbs harder. For the first time, you are the hunted. The Germans never expected it. Their intelligence reports didn't believe the Americans could safely handle 100-fit octane fuel. Their scientists argued it would burn engines, melt pistons, or cause detonation. But Allied engineers, especially those in Britain and the US, proved them wrong. They pushed the chemistry, refined the additives, and tuned the engines until the results were nothing short of miraculous. This was more than a mechanical upgrade. It was a turning point in the psychology of war. Suddenly, Allied pilots, who had once flown with fear, felt a surge of confidence. They could escort bombers deep into Germany, fight off interceptors, and still have the power to come home. The long-range Mustang, now blazing through the skies at nearly 500 miles per hour, became the very symbol of Allied air supremacy. 150-grade fuel didn't just make engines faster, it made victory faster. Every gallon carried with it years of research, gallons of sweat, and thousands of lives depending on its success. Engineers at Rolls-Royce, chemists in American refineries, and brave test pilots risked everything to push the limits of combustion, pressure, and performance. And let's not forget what this transformation meant strategically. The Luftwaffe's once proud defense network began to crumble. The Mustangs hunted German fighters from Berlin to the Baltic. Fuel convoys, factories, and airfields once thought untouchable were now within Allied reach. The balance of the air war tipped, and it never swung back. Yet what makes this story extraordinary isn't just the science, it's the spirit behind it. It's the relentless determination to innovate, to adapt, and to overcome. It's proof that wars are not only fought with bullets and bravery, but with brains, chemistry, and courage in laboratories and workshops. Think about it. What is 150-grade fuel but a metaphor for human progress? It represents the moment when limitation met imagination and imagination won. It's a reminder that every great leap in history happens when someone dares to say, what if? What if we could fly faster? What if we could go further? What if we could do the impossible? And that's what the P-51 Mustang, fueled by 150 octane power, truly symbolizes: the triumph of ingenuity over fear. It wasn't just an airplane, it was a promise to every soldier and citizen that technology and teamwork could rewrite fate itself. When those silver Mustangs thundered over Germany, the sound wasn't merely the hum of engines. It was the roar of hope. It told the world that freedom had found its wings. By the war's end, the P-51 Mustang had become an icon, not just of air superiority, but of what humanity can achieve when necessity fuels innovation. The Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, never anticipated that a simple change in fuel chemistry could outpace their empire of machinery. Yet that's the beauty of history. It rewards creativity, not complacency. So the next time you hear that powerful phrase, Germans never expected 150-grade fuel to turn P-51s into 49mm demons, remember that it's not just a story of aviation, it's a story of transformation. A story of how science and courage working together can tilt the balance of the world. Because in every engine that roared and every pilot who flew, there was one burning truth: when you give human determination the right fuel, nothing is impossible. Thank you. When the Second World War erupted across Europe, the battlefield was not only fought on land and sea but stretched into a new and unforgiving dimension: the sky. The air became a realm where courage met engineering, where strategy met science, and where nations discovered that whoever commanded the skies could command the course of the war itself. By the early 1940s, it had become painfully clear to the Allied powers that Germany's Luftwaffe was a force unlike any other. Their pilots were well trained, their machines sleek and deadly, and their strategy precise. From the Blitz over London to the raids across Europe, the Luftwaffe's dominance was visible in every contrail streaking the clouds. For the Allies, it was a nightmare of attrition. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were sent deep into enemy territory to cripple German factories, oil refineries, and rail networks. These missions were essential, but they were also deadly. German fighters, flying faster and higher, could tear through bomber formations before Allied aircraft even saw them coming. Escort fighters, the aircraft meant to protect bombers, simply could not fly far enough or fast enough. Their limited range forced them to turn back long before bombers reached the heart of Germany, leaving the lumbering aircraft exposed and vulnerable. The losses were catastrophic. Entire bomber groups vanished into the smoke and sky. Pilots were lost, crews captured, and morale began to waver. The situation demanded not just bravery but breakthrough innovation. The Allies needed something that could shift the balance. A fighter with the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany, the speed to outfly the Luftwaffe, and the agility to dominate in combat. It was not merely about aircraft. It was about survival, control, and ultimately victory. Amidst this desperation emerged the P-51 Mustang, designed by North American Aviation in response to a British request for a new fighter. What started as a hurried project would soon become one of the most iconic aircraft in history. Its frame was sleek, aerodynamic, and efficient, but its early models, powered by the Allison engine, struggled at high altitudes. The potential was there, sleeping beneath the metal skin, waiting for the right spark to awaken it. Engineers knew that the Mustang could be something extraordinary. It only needed the right heart to bring it to life. That heart came in the form of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a British marvel of engineering that had already proven its worth in Spitfires and Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. When the Merlin was fitted into the Mustang's frame, the transformation was astonishing. Suddenly, the aircraft climbed faster, flew higher, and handled with grace. It was faster than many German fighters, and could hold its own in dogfights that once spelled doom for Allied pilots. Yet even with this incredible fusion of design and power, the Mustang's true potential remained untapped. It was a sleeping giant, restrained not by its mechanics but by its fuel. You see, in the world of aviation, fuel is not just a liquid, it's the lifeblood of performance. The octane rating of fuel determines how much compression an engine can handle before detonating, and therefore how much power it can generate. The standard aviation fuel at the time, around 100 octane, worked well for most engines but limited how much boost pressure pilots could safely apply without risking engine failure. In combat, every extra ounce of power could mean the difference between victory and death. The Allies needed more. They needed fuel that could push engines beyond their limits without tearing them apart. Meanwhile, the Germans believed they had already reached the pinnacle of aviation chemistry. Their Bf-109s and Fu-190s ran on excellent high-grade fuel, and their engineers dismissed the idea that the Allies could create something more potent. Their intelligence reports underestimated the Allied capacity for industrial innovation, and that miscalculation would soon haunt them. Across laboratories in Britain and America, teams of chemists and engineers began experimenting with refining methods, additives, and blending techniques to push octane ratings higher. The process was complex and dangerous. A single miscalculation could destroy an engine or cause catastrophic explosions. But necessity breeds invention, and in the crucible of war, the impossible becomes merely a challenge to overcome. By 1944, the breakthrough came. The Allies had developed a new aviation fuel, 150, grade octane, far more resistant to pre-ignition and detonation. It allowed engines to run at higher boost pressures, delivering more horsepower without overheating or damage. For the P-51 Mustang's Merlin engine, this was like injecting lightning into its veins. With 150 grade fuel, the engine could be pushed harder and longer, generating a surge of speed and climb that stunned even its test pilots. What had been a fast aircraft suddenly became a demon of the sky, capable of reaching speeds close to 40-90 miles per hour, climbing faster than ever before, and maintaining power at altitudes where German fighters struggled to breathe. This transformation did not just enhance performance, it rewrote tactics. For the first time, Allied pilots could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. They could engage the Luftwaffe on equal terms, or better. The air war that had once been a struggle for survival began to shift in the Allies' favor. German pilots, who once felt untouchable in their Messerschmitts, now found themselves being hunted by silver Mustangs that seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as fast. The fuel alone, of course, was not the sole cause of victory, but it became the hidden weapon, the unseen edge that turned every Mustang into a predator. It gave Allied pilots not only speed but confidence. Imagine the psychological impact. For years, the Luftwaffe had owned the skies, dictating when and where battles occurred. Now every encounter carried uncertainty for them. The rules of engagement had changed, and yet, what is perhaps most remarkable about this moment in history is that it was born from the simplest of human qualities, the refusal to accept defeat. The development of 150 grade fuel required thousands of unseen heroes, The chemists who risked explosions in their laboratories, the refinery workers who blended volatile chemicals under pressure, the test pilots who flew experimental aircraft on the edge of destruction, and the strategists who believed that innovation could win wars. Each of them played a part in this silent revolution of power and speed. The sky, once dominated by the Luftwaffe's dark wings, began to shimmer with the silver flash of Mustangs. The tide of war was turning, not through sheer numbers, but through ingenuity and resilience. Allied bombers that had once fallen in waves now had protectors capable of going the distance. The air corridors to Germany were no longer death traps but highways to victory. This was the moment when the air war evolved from survival to supremacy. The Allies learned that control of the air was not a luxury. It was the foundation of every operation below. With every successful escort mission, with every German fighter shot down, the strategic balance shifted. Cities that had once been beyond reach now trembled under the thunder of Allied raids. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, began to crumble from exhaustion and loss. And all of it began because someone believed that better was possible. That even something as simple as fuel could change the course of history. The P-51 Mustang was the right machine, the Merlin was the right engine, but without 150 grade fuel, they were just parts of a potential waiting to be realized. Together, they became a legend, a testament to what human will and science can accomplish when they work in harmony. The first key to understanding this transformation lies in recognizing how desperate the Allies were for an advantage, and how the pursuit of that advantage led them to reimagine everything. From metallurgy to chemistry, from aerodynamics to logistics. The Germans had mastery, but the Allies had adaptability, and in war, it is adaptability that survives. The sky, once a domain of terror for bomber crews, became a stage for innovation courage. Every time a P-51 Mustang lifted off with tanks full of 150 grade fuel, it carried with it not just a pilot, but the combined effort of an entire industrial ecosystem. A collaboration between scientists, soldiers, and strategists, all striving toward one purpose. And when those engines roared to life, echoing across the airfields of England, they announced more than just the start of another mission. They declared that the balance of power in the air had changed forever. The first spark of that transformation, the understanding that the sky was the true battlefield, was what set the entire chain in motion. Without control of the air, armies could not advance, fleets could not sail safely, and cities could not be defended. The Allies' realization that air superiority was the key to survival drove them to pursue every technological edge, every possible improvement. It was not a single invention or a single battle that turned the tide, but the unrelenting pursuit of better solutions. The story of 150 grade fuel and the P-51 Mustang begins, therefore, not in a factory or a lab, but in the determination of a people who refuse to surrender the skies. It is the story of how innovation becomes weaponized, how knowledge becomes defense, and how in the crucible of war, the very elements of air and fire are bent to serve human will. The Allies' victory in the air began long before their Mustangs screamed across German skies. It began the moment they understood that the sky itself was the true battleground, and that mastery of it would decide the fate of the world. When the first P-51 Mustang rolled out of the North American Aviation factory in 1940, few could have imagined that this aircraft would one day become the symbol of Allied air dominance. Born from urgency and necessity, the Mustang's story is one of innovation under pressure, of how a design that began as a response to Britain's desperate plea for more fighters evolved into a weapon that changed the very balance of the air war. In its early form, however, the P-51 was a machine of unfulfilled promise. It was good, remarkably good, but it wasn't yet the legend it would become. When Britain first approached North American aviation, they didn't come seeking an entirely new aircraft. The Royal Air Force had wanted more Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, a fighter that was sturdy and reliable, but rapidly becoming outdated. North Americans engineers, led by James Dutch, Kindleberger and Edgar Schiemuth, boldly proposed something better, an entirely new fighter that could outperform the P-40 and still be built in record time. The British agreed, and the result was the prototype designated the NA-73X, a machine that embodied American design brilliance and British wartime need. From the moment the prototype took to the air in October 1940, it was clear that something special had been created. The P-51 Mustang featured a revolutionary laminar flow wing, a design that minimized drag and allowed it to cut through the air with exceptional efficiency. Its sleek fuselage and low-drag radiator scoop gave it a streamlined profile that promised speed and agility. On paper, it was everything a modern fighter should be, fast, elegant, and ahead of its time. But war is rarely kind to paper promises. The early P-51s were equipped with the Allison V-1710 engine, a sturdy American power plant that performed well at low and medium altitudes but struggled above 15,000 feet. Unfortunately, that was the realm where the Luftwaffe ruled supreme. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were designed for high-altitude performance, where they intercepted Allied bombers and engaged enemy fighters. When the Mustang climbed to those altitudes, its Allison engine began to gasp for air, losing power, speed, and maneuverability. It could still outturn and outdive many opponents at lower levels, but in the upper sky where the real battles were being fought, it was outmatched. For a time, the Mustang served primarily as a reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft. Its range, stability, and rugged design made it perfect for low-level missions, strafing convoys, and attacking enemy infrastructure. Pilots appreciated its handling and reliability, but it was clear that the Mustang had the soul of a racehorse trapped in the body of a workhorse. It could do more, it was meant to do more, but something was holding it back. That something was the engine. And in war, every limitation is a challenge waiting for the right mind to overcome it. The British, always keen observers of performance, suspected that the Mustang's airframe had far greater potential than its Allison engine allowed. Across the Atlantic, engineers at Rolls-Royce were working wonders with their Merlin engine, the same power plant that had given the Supermarine Spitfire its wings of victory in the Battle of Britain. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger allowed it to maintain high power output even at great altitudes, a critical advantage in dogfighting and bomber escort missions. Someone somewhere must have looked at the Mustang and thought, what if we put a Merlin in it? It was a simple question, but one that would change the course of aviation history. In late 1942, British engineers at Rolls-Royce and the American Packard Motor Company, which was producing Merlin engines under license, began experimenting. They replaced the Allison engine with a Packard-built Merlin and adjusted the airframe to accommodate the new power plant's cooling and airflow requirements. The results were immediate and astonishing. The transformed aircraft, designated the P-51B and later the P-51C, was no longer just a promising design, it was a revelation. The new Mustang could now reach speeds of over 40 miles per hour, climb rapidly to high altitudes, and maneuver with a grace that left pilots speechless. Its range, already impressive, now stretched even further. With drop tanks, it could fly over 1,600 miles, escorting bombers deep into German territory and back again, something no other Allied fighter could do. Test pilots returned from their first flights awestruck. They had flown many aircraft before, Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, but nothing felt like this. The Mustang wasn't just fast, it was balanced. It responded like an extension of the pilot's own body, turning, climbing, and diving with unmatched harmony. Its laminar flow wings sliced through the air with minimal resistance, and its control surfaces allowed precise handling even at extreme speeds. Pilots described it as fighter that flew like a dream but fought like a demon. In the European theater, where every mission was a test of endurance and courage, this new P-51 was the answer to the Allies' prayers. Until its arrival, bomber crews flying missions into Germany had to endure terrifying odds. The Luftwaffe's fighters would wait for the Allied escorts to turn back, limited by fuel and range, and then swoop in to devastate the bomber formations. Losses were staggering. But when the Mustangs arrived, they didn't turn back, they stayed. They flew side by side with the bombers all the way to the target, engaged German fighters head-on, and still had fuel to fight their way home. For the first time, the bombers had true guardians of the sky. The Germans were unprepared for this shift. Their intelligence reports knew of the Mustang but dismissed it as just another Allied fighter. They did not realize that this new P-51 was powered by a Merlin heart, and that this combination had transformed it into something entirely different. A machine capable of matching or exceeding the speed and performance of their best aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, began to lose control. German pilots found themselves facing an enemy that could climb higher, dive faster, and stay in the fight longer. The Mustang's presence altered not only tactics but morale. For Allied bomber crews, the sight of the silver, winged P-51s weaving through their formations was a sight of salvation. They called them little friends. For the German pilots, those same glints of silver meant something else entirely, the beginning of the end of their air superiority. Even the psychological balance of the air war began to shift. Confidence was contagious, and the Allies now had it in abundance. Behind this success lay an extraordinary collaboration. The Mustang's design was American, its engine British, and its fuel soon to be an Allied innovation that would unlock even more power. It represented the very spirit of unity that defined the Allied war effort. Different nations, different minds working together for a single purpose. This synthesis of design and engineering was not the result of chance but of shared determination. The British had believed in the Mustang's potential even when its early versions faltered. The Americans had the industrial might to produce it in staggering numbers. Together, they forged the ultimate long-range fighter. When the P-51D model entered service in 1944, it brought even more improvements. Better visibility through a bubble canopy, increased firepower with 6.50 caliber machine guns, and refinements that made it one of the most complete fighters of the war. It became the backbone of the US 8th Air Force, escorting bombers on raids over Berlin, Leipzig, and Hamburg. It hunted German fighters relentlessly, sweeping the skies clean ahead of Allied ground advances. But beyond statistics and engineering, there was something almost poetic about the P-51 Mustang's evolution. It began as an aircraft built to meet a contract, a hurried response to an urgent demand. Yet through the vision of engineers and the courage of pilots, it became a masterpiece of aviation art. It was as if destiny had sculpted it piece by piece, the wings, the fuselage, the engine, until everything aligned perfectly. The sleeping giant had awakened, and when it did, it roared. For the men who flew it, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was a companion, a protector, and sometimes a miracle. Pilots spoke of its reliability, its forgiving nature, and its strength. It could take hits and keep flying, it could dive out of danger, and it could fight its way through anything. There was a bond between pilot and plane, a sense of trust that few aircraft ever inspired. Many who flew Mustangs later said that it felt alive, as if it understood what was being asked of it and gave everything in return. The Mustang story is also the story of innovation rising from necessity. War compresses time, forcing invention at a pace that peace rarely demands. Engineers who might have taken years to test and refine ideas instead had to make breakthroughs in months. The Mustang is the embodiment of that wartime urgency, an aircraft that went from drawing board to legend in record time because the world simply could not wait. And when that sleeping giant finally stretched its wings, it did more than just fight, it defined a new era of air combat. The combination of its aerodynamic efficiency, long-range, high-speed, and high-altitude performance set the standard for post-war fighter design. Long after the guns fell silent, the Mustang would go on to serve in other conflicts, breaking speed records and reminding generations of aviators what true engineering excellence looked like. But in those crucial years of 1943 and 1944, when the fate of Europe hung in the balance, the awakening of the Mustang changed everything. It was proof that brilliance often begins with imperfection, that even a machine that starts with flaws can evolve into something extraordinary when imagination, collaboration, and persistence come together. The P-51 Mustang was no longer just a fighter, it was freedom with wings. The world of aviation, especially during the crucible of the Second World War, was not simply a contest of machines but a relentless battle of chemistry, physics, and human ingenuity. When the Allies discovered the power of 150-grade high-octane aviation fuel, they did not merely improve performance, they transformed their aircraft into something extraordinary. It was an invisible weapon, a force of innovation that the Germans never anticipated, one that would supercharge engines, rewrite tactics, and change the tempo of the air war forever. In many ways, this fuel was as decisive as any new aircraft design or weapon system. It was the hidden spark that turned the P-51 Mustang from an exceptional fighter into a near supernatural force that dominated the skies at almost 500 miles per hour. To understand the significance of 150-grade fuel, one must understand what octane means in the first place. Every internal combustion engine, whether in a car or an aircraft, works by compressing fuel and air in its cylinders and igniting the mixture to create power. The more the mixture can be compressed before ignition, the more energy the engine can release. But there is a limit. Push it too far and the fuel explodes prematurely, causing knocking, which can destroy an engine. High-octane fuel resists this premature detonation, allowing for higher compression, greater boost pressures, and consequently far more power. The higher the octane, the harder the engine can work without tearing itself apart. Before 1944, but generally powered by 100-octane fuel, already an advancement over the 87-octane used earlier in the war. It was a good fuel, stable, efficient, and safe. But as air combat intensified, it became clear that good was no longer enough. Pilots needed every ounce of speed, climb rate, and power that could be extracted from their engines. The Luftwaffe's fighters, especially the Focke-Wulf Tu-190 and the later models of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, were fierce opponents with engines fine-tuned for performance. They could dive, climb, and maneuver aggressively, often giving German pilots an edge in battle. To match and surpass them, Allied engineers had to think beyond design and mechanics. They had to look inside the very lifeblood of flight, the fuel itself. Across Britain and the United States, scientists and chemists began experimenting with refining methods to create a fuel that could sustain higher power output without causing detonation. They blended base stocks with special additives, tetraethyl lead aromatic hydrocarbons and other compounds, to improve stability and resistance to pre-ignition. It was dangerous, complex work. Laboratories became miniature battlefields of science, where experiments could end in explosions if the balance of chemicals went wrong. But from that danger came breakthrough after breakthrough. The result was 150-grade aviation fuel, a substance that seemed almost magical in what it allowed engines to do. When this fuel was introduced to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines powering the P-51 Mustangs, the transformation was immediate and dramatic. The Merlin was already a superb engine famous for its reliability and smooth performance. But it had been limited by the fuels available to it. Once fed with 150 octane, the Merlin could be pushed to a new level. Higher manifold pressures, greater power at altitude, and astonishing acceleration. Test results stunned even the engineers who had created it. Aircraft running on the new fuel achieved top speeds approaching 40-90 miles per hour, an extraordinary number for piston-driven fighters of the time. Climb rates improved sharply, allowing Mustangs to reach combat altitude faster than ever before. In dogfights, every second mattered. The ability to climb or accelerate even slightly faster could determine who lived and who died. With 150-grade fuel, those seconds belonged to the Allies. The Germans had no answer. Their own fuel, though high quality, was limited to around 96 to 100 octane, constrained by refining capacity and access to key additives. They had experimented with synthetic fuels derived from coal, but these were never as efficient or powerful as what the Allies were now producing in vast quantities. The Luftwaffe's engineers simply did not believe the Allies could safely run engines at the kind of boost pressures 150-grade fuel allowed. They assumed that doing so would cause catastrophic failures. To their shock, the opposite was true. Allied engines, properly tuned and maintained, handled the stress beautifully, producing sustained power levels that defied German expectations. The first combat trials of aircraft using the new fuel began in 1944. Pilots returning from missions reported incredible results. They could dive away from German fighters with ease, climb through the clouds at rates that left enemies behind, and chase down targets that previously would have escaped. A P-51 on 150 grade fuel could keep pace with or surpass anything the Luftwaffe fielded. Even the feared foe 190, with its powerful BMW radial engine, struggled to compete at higher altitudes where the Mustang thrived. The difference wasn't only in speed, it was in control. The high-octane fuel allowed the Merlin engine to maintain consistent power output even under extreme stress. In combat where pilots throttled up and down, performed tight turns and dove at high speeds, the stability of power delivery was vital. The Mustang didn't just go fast, it went fast smoothly, without the surging or engine knock that could plague lesser fuels. Pilots could rely on their machines completely, focusing on the fight rather than worrying about mechanical limits. The tactical implications were enormous. Before the introduction of 150 grade fuel, Allied fighters struggled to maintain air cover for long-range bombing missions. The Luftwaffe could wait until escort fighters turned back and then ambush the bombers. But with the enhanced performance and range of P-51s using high-octane fuel, those days were over. The Mustangs could accompany bombers deep into German territory and back again, engaging interceptors all the way. It was as if an invisible shield had been placed over the bomber formations. German pilots began to realize, with growing dread, that there was no longer any safe altitude, no sanctuary in the sky. There was also a psychological shift. Power has a sound, a deep, confident growl that can be heard before it's seen. The 150 octane fueled Merlin had that sound. German pilots spoke of the distinct menacing hum of Mustangs as they approached, a sound that seemed to announce inevitability. In dogfights, Allied pilots now felt an exhilarating confidence. They knew their aircraft could push harder, climb longer, and fight faster. That morale boost was almost as valuable as the technical one. Behind the scenes, however, the story of 150 grade fuel was also one of immense industrial effort. Producing such a high-performance fuel required advanced refining techniques and massive logistical coordination. The United States, with its vast oil resources and industrial capacity, became the powerhouse behind its production. Refineries in places like Baton Rouge, Baytown, and Philadelphia worked around the clock to meet demand. Tankers carried the precious liquid across the Atlantic, where it was distributed to Allied airfields under tight security. Every gallon was a product of chemistry, courage, and coordination. There were challenges too. Engines had to be carefully tuned to handle the increased boost pressures. Maintenance crews were trained to monitor temperatures, pressures, and mixture ratios to ensure reliability. But once those systems were perfected, the results spoke for themselves. The Mustang became quite literally a different aircraft. It could chase down enemy fighters at will, escort bombers at high altitude, and, when necessary, dive into the fray with unstoppable force. For the Germans, the sudden leap in Allied performance was bewildering. Intelligence officers tried to make sense of reports from the front. How were the Americans achieving such speeds? How could their aircraft climb so fast or maintain such consistent power at altitude? They suspected some new engine design or supercharger modification, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. It was the fuel, a chemical change that, to the naked eye, looked no different from any other gasoline, had quietly rewritten the laws of aerial warfare. The irony was that German chemists were among the best in the world. Before the war, they had pioneered synthetic fuels and advanced lubricants. But by 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had crippled their refineries, disrupted supply chains, and made large-scale production of high-quality fuel nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the Allies, with their protected industrial base, continued to refine, experiment, and innovate. The result was not only superiority in numbers but in performance, an edge that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. Every major technological revolution in warfare carries with it a moment of disbelief, a point when one side realizes that the other has achieved something they thought impossible. For the Luftwaffe, that moment came when they first encountered the 150 octane fueled Mustangs. The speed readings didn't make sense. Their pilots reported being overtaken in dives, chased at altitudes where Allied fighters were once sluggish, and out-climbed even by heavily armed escorts. Their commanders dismissed these claims at first, attributing them to pilot error or exaggeration. But as the encounters multiplied, denial gave way to grim acceptance. The enemy's machines had surpassed theirs, and all of it traced back to fuel. Not a new weapon, not a new airframe, but the invisible chemistry of progress. The Allies had unlocked more than octane. They had unlocked potential. They had demonstrated that in war, as in peace, the key to victory often lies in unseen details, in the willingness to question limits and test boundaries. The 150 grade fuel wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a symbol of how deeply intertwined science and warfare had become. It represented the merging of the laboratory and the battlefield, where equations written in chalk on a board translated into speed and survival thousands of feet above the earth. For the men who flew with it, this invisible innovation was life itself, the difference between being hunted and being free. In the skies over Europe, the P-51 Mustang, once a capable fighter, became something almost supernatural. It could dive through cloud and sunlight alike, chase its prey across the horizon, and return home unscathed. Pilots described the feeling as intoxicating. The raw surge of power, the effortless climb, the way the machine seemed to leap forward when the throttle was opened. It was as if the aircraft itself knew what it had become, a demon of speed, a creation of fire, metal, and chemistry. And for the Germans, who had once ruled the sky with confidence, the sound of those engines was a warning. A reminder that innovation never sleeps, and that sometimes, the greatest weapon of all is the one you can't see. When the skies over Europe began to hum with the deep, steady roar of Allied engines that never seemed to tire, the German Luftwaffe knew something had changed. But they did not yet understand what. For years, the air war had been their domain, their stage of dominance. From the Polish campaign in 1939 to the early triumphs of the Blitz, the Luftwaffe had built an almost mythic reputation as an unstoppable force. Their tactics were precise, their aircraft deadly, and their pilots some of the best trained warriors in the world. But by late 1943 and into 1944, cracks began to appear, first small then widening, until the entire structure of their air superiority began to crumble. What the Germans did not know was that beneath this collapse lay an invisible enemy: chemistry, innovation, and fuel. The introduction of 150 octane fuel to Allied aircraft, and the transformation it created in planes like the P-51 Mustang, sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe that went far beyond the battlefield. It shattered their confidence, unbalanced their strategy, and exposed the limits of even their most advanced engineering. At first, reports from the front seemed unbelievable. German pilots returning from missions over France and the Low Countries spoke of American fighters that climbed with unnatural speed, that dove faster than anything they had ever seen, and that could maintain pursuit well into the high altitudes where Luftwaffe planes were supposed to reign supreme. Intelligence officers dismissed the accounts as exaggeration or combat fatigue. After all, the performance of Allied aircraft had been consistent for years. The British Spitfires, the American Thunderbolts and Mustangs, they were formidable, yes, but familiar. The Luftwaffe had studied them in detail, captured some, even flown them in tests. There was nothing the Allies could do to make those machines defy physics. But the battlefield was changing, and the Germans were watching a miracle unfold in the skies, one they did not understand and could not counter. In air combat, power translates to life. The ability to climb faster means the difference between being the hunter and the hunted. The ability to accelerate in a dive means the ability to escape or to strike with lethal precision. For years, the Luftwaffe's fighters, especially the Foch, Wolf 190 and the Messerschmitt Bf 109G, had enjoyed an advantage in these critical aspects. Their engines, fine-tuned and engineered to the limits of technology, delivered bursts of power that made them supreme in the right hands. But as the Allies began feeding 150-grade fuel into the Rolls-Royce Merlin and Packard-built engines of the P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires, everything shifted. German pilots suddenly found themselves out-climbed, out-dived, and most painfully outrun. They could not believe what they were seeing. Their aircraft, once symbols of supremacy, were now struggling to keep up with their enemies. The shock was not only physical, it was psychological. Luftwaffe pilots, trained to fight aggressively and with absolute confidence, began to lose faith in their machines. There was an old saying among pilots, "Trust your aircraft and it will bring you home." But now, even the most experienced aces felt betrayed by their engines. In engagements over Normandy, over the Ardennes, and later over Germany itself, they would pour every ounce of throttle into their machines, only to watch the Allied fighters close in effortlessly. It wasn't just a loss of performance, it was a loss of pride. For men who had once believed they flew the finest aircraft in the world, realizing that the Allies had surpassed them was a bitter humiliation. At German airfields, confusion reigned. Engineers and mechanics tore apart captured Allied aircraft, examining every bolt and piston for clues. What they found puzzled them. The engines were familiar designs, not dramatically different from those they already knew. The airframes were elegant but not revolutionary. There was no hidden supercharger, no secret modification, nothing that explained the leap in performance. What they could not see, what no inspection could reveal, was the invisible difference inside the fuel tanks. The 150-grade fuel the Allies now used had properties beyond anything the Germans could produce. It allowed the Merlin engine to run at unprecedented boost pressures, generating massive power without the detonation that would destroy lesser fuels. It was the quiet genius of chemistry that had outpaced even Germany's engineering prowess. By the time the Luftwaffe began to grasp the truth, the damage was irreversible. Their own fuel supply was deteriorating rapidly. Allied bombing campaigns had systematically targeted refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation lines. Germany's dependence on synthetic fuel, produced from coal through the Fischer-Tropsch process, became its Achilles heel. The synthetic fuel was serviceable but inferior, with lower octane ratings and poor performance at high altitudes. Engineers tried to compensate by increasing supercharger pressures and adjusting mixture ratios, but these were desperate measures that strained engines and reduced lifespan. While the Allies' Mustangs soared at 490 miles per hour, the Luftwaffe's fighters often struggled with unreliable engines and dwindling supplies. The introduction of 150-octane fuel to the Allies' range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe's strategic position. Before its arrival, Germany's one remaining advantage lay in its defense, in-depth strategy. They could wait for Allied bombers to reach their operational limits, knowing that the fighters escorting them would have to turn back due to limited range. Once the escorts left, the Luftwaffe could descend upon the bomber streams with near impunity. It was a brutal but effective tactic. The arrival of the Mustang, with its massive range and high speed endurance, already threatened this strategy. But once the Mustang was upgraded with 150-grade fuel, the threat turned into annihilation. Now the P-51s could not only escort bombers deep into the heart of Germany but also engage in extended dogfights on equal or superior terms with the Luftwaffe's finest fighters. The first missions that used the new fuel left a deep mark. Luftwaffe commanders were stunned by the losses. Entire squadrons of interceptors were cut down before they could even reach bomber formations. Pilots who once dived confidently into battle now hesitated, aware that the enemy was faster, could climb higher, and could stay in the fight longer. There was no tactical adjustment that could fully compensate for that. Desperation led to the introduction of emergency power systems like MW50, methanol water injection that temporarily increased boost pressure, but this was only a stopgap. It provided a short burst of extra power at the cost of engine reliability and fuel consumption. Against the sustained performance of Mustangs on 150-grade fuel, these measures were little more than bandages on a mortal wound. The psychological toll was immense. The Luftwaffe had been built on a foundation of aggressive doctrine. Attack first, press the advantage, overwhelm the enemy with speed and precision. But when the tables turned, that doctrine became a liability. Pilots could no longer rely on superior acceleration to disengage, nor could they climb out of danger. The hunter had become the hunted, and every encounter carried the risk of annihilation. For the younger pilots, often sent into battle with minimal training due to Germany's mounting losses, morale plummeted. They entered the skies knowing that their chances of survival were slim, facing enemies who seemed to have limitless power and endurance. For veterans, the frustration was palpable. They could see the skill of their comrades wasted against machines that simply outperformed their own in every measurable way. Within the Luftwaffe's command structure, panic turned into paralysis. Strategic discussions became circular. Some insisted the Allies had developed an entirely new type of engine. Others proposed that the Americans were secretly using jet-assisted fighters. It seemed impossible that such an advantage could come merely from fuel. But when samples of Allied gasoline were finally analyzed, the truth became undeniable. The octane rating was higher than anything Germany could achieve under wartime conditions. Their chemical industry, once a global leader, was now strangled by shortages of vital additives like tetrathiol lead and isooctane. Even when attempts were made to produce high-octane blends, the lack of refining capacity and raw materials rendered them inconsistent and unreliable. Meanwhile, the effects of this imbalance rippled through every level of the Luftwaffe's operations. Airfields came under increasing attack as the Allies gained air supremacy. Supply lines were bombed with impunity. Aircraft production continued, but without skilled pilots and reliable fuel, new fighters were little more than targets waiting to be destroyed. The introduction of the jet-powered Me-262 offered a brief glimmer of hope, but even that revolutionary aircraft could not operate in sufficient numbers to change the tide. And when the Me-262s took off, they often faced swarms of Mustangs already waiting above them. Powered by the same invisible advantage that had crippled the Luftwaffe months earlier, the shock extended beyond the airfields. On the ground, ordinary German citizens began to notice the change in the skies. Where once the Luftwaffe had been a source of national pride, now the sound of Allied bombers and their escorts filled the air day and night. Civilians watched helplessly as their cities burned, wondering why their own fighters seemed unable to stop the destruction. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility, carefully crafted by years of propaganda, disintegrated under the reality of Allied air dominance. For the first time, the German people could see that their air force was no longer a shield, but a remnant of past glory. Inside the command rooms of Berlin, the truth was bitter. The Luftwaffe's leaders, men who had once orchestrated the Blitz over London, were now powerless to defend their own capital. Reports poured in daily, losses mounting, fuel reserves dwindling, morale collapsing. Every attempt to counter the Allied advance was met with overwhelming firepower from the sky. The Allies had achieved what the Luftwaffe once believed impossible: total control of the air. And all of it, to a large extent, stemmed from a change so small and so technical that it defied imagination. A few extra molecules of resistance to detonation, a few degrees more compression, a few pounds more of boost, had tilted the balance of the war. To the German engineers and pilots who survived the war, the realization was both humbling and haunting. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not only by numbers or strategy but by innovation, by an unseen evolution in science that their enemy had quietly mastered. In interviews and memoirs after the war, many Luftwaffe veterans spoke with awe about the sudden transformation of Allied aircraft. They remembered the moment they first encountered a Mustang that seemed to climb forever, or a Spitfire that accelerated beyond anything physics should have allowed. It was, in their eyes, as if the Allies had discovered a secret source of power, a gift from the gods of flight. They did not yet know it was chemistry. In the end, the shock to the Luftwaffe was not just the loss of superiority, but the realization of how fragile dominance can be. The empire of the air they had once ruled so confidently had been undone by an invisible force. It was not bombs or bullets that broke their pride first. It was the quiet hiss of fuel flowing through an Allied engine, the unseen transformation of science into speed, and the echoing roar of an aircraft that could no longer be caught. As the Second World War reached its crescendo, the fate of nations was being decided not only by soldiers on the ground or generals in war rooms, but by the invisible alchemy of fuel coursing through engines thousands of feet above the earth. The Allies' adoption of 150-octane fuel was not a mere technical adjustment. It was a turning point, a decisive transformation that rippled through every theater of the air war. This innovation, hidden within the roar of engines and the shimmer of contrails, helped shift the balance of power irreversibly. When historians speak of D-Day, of strategic bombing campaigns, and of Allied dominance in 1944 and 1945, they often credit courage, strategy, and numbers. But behind all of that lay a potent secret, a few molecules that made the difference between life and death, victory and defeat. The 150-octane fuel, born of chemistry and necessity, became one of the silent architects of Allied triumph. In warfare, small advantages accumulate until they form an unbreakable edge. By early 1944, the Allies were preparing for their greatest challenge, the invasion of occupied Europe. Success required absolute control of the skies. Every bomber, every transport, every paratrooper dropping into Normandy depended on the ability of Allied fighters to dominate the air above them. For months, Allied scientists, engineers, and tacticians had been working to ensure that when the time came, no German aircraft would be able to threaten the invasion. The P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire Mackay-X, and the P-47 Thunderbolt were already formidable machines, but they needed just a little more speed, more climb rate, more endurance, to make total air supremacy possible. That little more came in a canister marked with 3 digits, 150. To understand the magnitude of what 150-octane fuel accomplished, one must first appreciate what it allowed engines to do. The octane rating of fuel measures its resistance to detonation under compression. Higher octane fuels allow for greater boost pressures in supercharged engines, meaning the pilot can force more air and fuel into the cylinders without causing premature ignition, an event that would otherwise destroy the engine. Before the introduction of 150-grade fuel, Allied aircraft used 100-130 fuel, which allowed for moderate boost levels. With 150-octane, pilots could safely increase manifold pressure by several pounds per square inch, unlocking enormous bursts of power. For the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66 engine used in late-model Spitfires and Mustangs, this meant an increase of over 300 horsepower, enough to transform an already excellent aircraft into something transcendent. The results were immediate and astonishing. Tests conducted by the Royal Air Force showed that Spitfires using 150-octane fuel gained as much as 25 miles per hour at sea level and over 15 miles per hour at higher altitudes. More importantly, their rate of climb improved dramatically. In combat, this meant that a pilot could reach advantageous positions faster, dive away from danger, or pursue fleeing enemies with newfound aggression. The P-51 Mustang, when fed with the same high-octane fuel, became a predator without equal, its top speed rising to nearly 490 miles per hour. Its acceleration so fierce that even veteran Luftwaffe pilots found themselves unable to break contact. The combination of this speed and the Mustang's immense range turned the air war into a one-sided contest. As 1944 unfolded, the strategic consequences became clear. The Allies no longer merely contested the skies, they owned them. The bomber streams that once suffered catastrophic losses over Germany now flew with powerful escorts that could not only defend but also hunt. The Luftwaffe, battered and demoralized, began to lose its grip entirely. German fighter bases were attacked relentlessly, their planes caught on the ground or intercepted moments after takeoff. The sheer energy unleashed by the 150-octane fueled engines allowed Allied fighters to dive on targets at incredible speeds, make multiple passes, and climb back into formation before the enemy could react. Each of these tactical advantages stemmed from a chemical leap invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable in its impact. When the Allied invasion of Normandy began on June 6, 1944, the importance of air supremacy was demonstrated on an unprecedented scale. In the days leading up to D-Day, Allied aircraft flew thousands of sorties, striking railways, convoys, radar installations, and coastal defenses. On the morning of the invasion, more than 11,000 aircraft filled the skies above northern France. German reinforcements attempting to move toward the beaches were annihilated from the air. Columns of tanks and trucks were reduced to wreckage before they could reach the front lines. The Luftwaffe's attempts to intervene were pitiful in comparison. Only a few scattered squadrons managed to take off, and those that did were swiftly intercepted by Mustangs and Thunderbolts running on 150-octane fuel. The few German aircraft that managed to penetrate the Allied air umbrella were hunted down ruthlessly. Not a single major Allied ship or landing zone suffered serious air attack that day. It was complete dominance, and high-performance fuel was one of the unseen engines behind it. The influence of 150-octane fuel extended beyond the skies over France. It reshaped the strategic bombing campaign over Germany itself. Before its introduction, long-range bombing missions were perilous ventures. B-17s and B-24s would fly deep into enemy territory, often without fighter escort for the final stages of the mission. Casualty rates among bomber crews were staggering, with some squadrons losing half their men within a few weeks. But once the Mustangs with their 150 fueled engines entered the fray, the situation reversed dramatically. Now, bombers were accompanied from takeoff to target and back. The Luftwaffe's once effective bomber-destroyer formations equipped with heavy cannons designed to shred Allied bombers became easy prey. The Allies could strike targets deep inside Germany, factories, oil refineries, transportation hubs, without suffering the crippling losses that had once plagued them. Every successful bombing run further degraded the German war machine, creating a downward spiral from which the rage could not recover. Fuel, in the end, became both weapon and weakness. As the Allies refined and distributed their superior fuel blends, Germany's own supplies dwindled. The destruction of Ploty, the loss of Romanian oil fields, and the bombing of synthetic fuel plants left the Luftwaffe desperate. Their remaining aviation fuel was often of such low quality that engines performed poorly and required frequent maintenance. The contrast could not have been starker. While Allied pilots pushed their engines to new limits, German pilots struggled to coax power from theirs. Allied intelligence reports even noted that captured German aircraft, when refueled with Allied 150-octane fuel, demonstrated significantly improved performance. A painful reminder of how critical this invisible resource had become. The power of the new fuel also forced changes in tactics and strategy that accelerated Allied success. Pilots began to fly higher and faster, engaging in vertical combat maneuvers that would have been impossible before. The ability to climb rapidly meant that Allied aircraft could dictate the terms of battle, striking from above and disengaging at will. In bomber escort missions, Mustangs used their speed advantage to patrol ahead and around the formations, ambushing German interceptors before they could organize. The same fuel also allowed ground attack fighters to operate with greater agility, strafing enemy columns and withdrawing before anti-aircraft fire could find its mark. The synergy between speed, altitude, and range turned the Allies' air forces into a precision instrument capable of shaping the battlefield below. But beyond the technical advantages, 150-octane fuel carried a deeper, almost symbolic meaning. It represented the triumph of Allied cooperation, the fusion of British scientific research, American industrial power, and shared determination. The fuel's development was itself a marvel of wartime ingenuity. Chemists in Britain and the United States experimented tirelessly with additives such as isooctane, tetraethyl lead, and aromatic hydrocarbons to produce a blend that could withstand the immense pressures of combat engines. Refineries were retooled, supply chains expanded, and testing facilities operated around the clock. The logistical challenge of producing and distributing this advanced fuel to every Allied airbase across Europe and the Pacific was monumental, yet it was accomplished with astonishing efficiency. Every gallon shipped was a small act of strategy, every drop a step closer to victory. In the final year of the war, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, the skies were no longer contested, they were owned. The Luftwaffe, reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, could no longer defend its cities or armies. Even the introduction of revolutionary weapons like the Mi-262 jet fighter could not reverse the tide. The jets were fast, yes, but they required massive amounts of specialized fuel, and their bases were under constant attack. Allied fighters running on their potent 150-octane lifeblood prowled the skies like watchful predators. Supply trains, bridges, and troop movements were obliterated before they could reinforce the front. German troops began to call the daylight hours terror from the sky, knowing that Allied aircraft were always overhead. On the ground, the consequences were immense. The success of the Normandy invasion, the rapid Allied advance through France, and the final offensives into Germany were all made possible by air superiority. Armies could move freely, supply lines could remain open, and enemy forces could be isolated and destroyed. Every tank that advanced, every soldier that marched, did so under the protective shadow of aircraft powered by that extraordinary fuel. It was not glamorous, and few outside the military understood its importance, but without it, the tempo of Allied operations would have slowed, and the cost of victory would have risen dramatically. Even in the Pacific theater, the lessons learned in Europe carried over. The high-octane fuels developed for Mustangs and Spitfires found their way into the engines of long-range bombers and naval aircraft, allowing them to operate farther, faster, and with greater reliability across vast oceanic distances. The technological leap that began as a solution for European air combat became a global standard for modern aviation, setting the stage for post-war advances in engine design, fuel chemistry, and flight performance. The legacy of 150-octane fuel lived on, not just in the stories of dogfights and daring pilots, but in the very DNA of aviation progress. For the men who fought the air war, the change was felt intimately. Pilots who had once struggled to gain altitude or chase an opponent now felt invincible. Mechanics, who once worried about engines overheating or detonating under stress, now marveled at their resilience. Commanders could plan missions with newfound confidence, knowing that their aircraft would not merely survive but dominate. The morale boost was immeasurable. It was as though the Allies had discovered an extra gear, a secret strength that the enemy could neither match nor understand. And in war, confidence is as powerful as firepower. The 150-octane fuel then was more than a scientific achievement. It was the silent hand guiding the Allies toward victory, the unseen force behind the roaring engines that darkened the skies over Europe and carried the hope of liberation on their wings. It was chemistry turned into destiny, innovation turned into triumph, and proof that sometimes the smallest changes, the subtlest refinements, can alter the course of history itself.